pray. Father, thank you for worship this morning. Lord, what a joy to come in on this second Sunday in April. Lord, the sun is shining, the air is still cool, but the buds are beginning to come out. We're beginning to see new life, and Lord, it felt that way this morning, even as we gathered to sing. Be with us, Lord, during the rest of our time. Help us to see what you would say to us through your word, through your servant who wrote this text, through the preparations that I've done throughout this week. May your word be spoken. Pray this in your name. Amen. Well, believe it or not, or maybe you don't remember it, prior to Lent, we were going through a sermon series on the book of Ecclesiastes. And that's where we're going to be today again. Now, don't freak out, okay? I didn't remember what I preached about either. So I went back, and I'm going to summarize it for us so we know where we're at and we know what we've been talking about. And so I'm going to spend a couple minutes up front reminding us of all that I've said so far, or at least giving us a context for what I said. And then we'll look at just two verses today from Ecclesiastes 5, verses 8 and 9. So where we've been in the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Ecclesiastes is written from the perspective of somebody who self-identifies as the preacher or the teacher. He was a king in Jerusalem. Most people assume and identify him as Solomon, the son of David. We're not entirely sure that that's who wrote it, but he's a good prototype. It was somebody who was similar to him, that would have had a very similar perspective to Solomon. That person was very wealthy, and that person was very wise, and that's why people assume, well, it was probably Solomon who asked the Lord for wisdom and was known as the wealthiest man alive during his time. Now, the sermon series we've entitled, and I've entitled, Under the Sun, because what this wealthy and wise author sets out to accomplish is to explore everything that he can find in all the earth to determine whether there is any meaning to human existence. And so he uncovers every rock, he looks in every corner, everything that he can see and everything that he can observe to answer this one question: is there any meaning to be found? His great wealth affords him the opportunity to conduct that extensive study, and his great wisdom allows him to come to some conclusions about that study after it's finished. And the reason that it matters who he is because it should occur to us, if this person who's extremely wealthy and extremely wise can't find any meaning, then what hope is there for the rest of us? And so after he does this study, he comes to his conclusion, and he lists it in the very opening verses of Ecclesiastes, and he says, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. He says, after I did an entire search of the whole world, everything that I could uncover with all of my wealth and all of my wisdom, what I discovered is that everything under the sun is completely and utterly meaningless. And the rest of the book is him offering his analysis of that. And he's going to do it in a very specific way. What he wants you to be thinking about, and the way that he's going to present his study to us, is by asking you, observe the world around me. Observe your world, observe your circumstances, and see if we don't come to the same conclusion that if all you have is what you can observe, if all you have is life around you, then wouldn't you agree that life is finally meaningless? He's not asking you to like his conclusion. He's not asking you if that makes you feel good. He's just saying, do you agree? Will you do the work with me? Will you observe the universe with me? Because he says that at the end of the day, whether because you're wise or a fool or rich or poor, even if things go somewhat well for you in life, even if you feel like you have made a contribution, everyone dies and no one remembers you. This is a pretty depressing book to be studying for like a significant period of time, right? But we know, again, he's not asking you to like the conclusion. He's asking you whether or not you agree. But and that would be supremely depressing if that's where the book ended. If the book ended with that observation, well, everyone, thanks for being here today. Life is meaningless. You're all going to die and be forgotten. Let's pray. If that was it, you'd go, this is horrendous. This is terrible. I don't like this book at all. But that's not where he stops. He's just saying, no, just look at life under the sun. If all you had was life under the sun, you'd have to agree that that is the end conclusion. But what he's going to present us with is to say, but there's more. Because there's something in you that screams out against that and says that can't possibly be true. Like, I can make those observations and I can come to the conclusions of the author of this text, but there's something in us, a small voice that screams out and says, that's not possible. There must be more meaning to this. And that's why he starts from this perspective. That's why he's asking you, observe the world around you. And you'll see that your conclusions don't line up with that little voice inside of you that's saying, but there must be more. And he goes, aha, see, there is more. But you aren't going to find it under the sun. You aren't going to find the meaning that you're searching for with the things that you already know. You're not going to find the meaning that you're looking for by observing your circumstances and in your measurable life. There is meaning, but doesn't start with life under the sun. And so the last time we were together, in the very last passage we read, we finally got to the point where the author presents us with how to approach God. He's given us his conclusions about so much of what he's observed, but then he says, but if you want to observe God, here's how you must approach him. You should approach him to listen to him. Don't presume upon him. Don't make assumptions about him. The underlying question that he wants you to ask when you think about God is this: who do you think you're really dealing with? Like, if there is a God, what do you think he's actually like? And then when you discover what he's like, then you must ask the question, then who gets to be in charge? And that's what set us up for our series throughout Lent, as we looked to Christ, as we looked at his resurrection. Now, the author of the text, of course, didn't know about Jesus' life, death, and ultimate resurrection, but the text still points to that in the power of the Holy Spirit. And so we now know about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And the question that functionally we end up asking as we get to his death and we get to his resurrection that we looked at last weekend is the same question. Who do we think we're dealing with? Who is Jesus? Is Jesus the Son of God? And if he is the Son of God, then who gets to be in charge? And that's what his death and his resurrection proved to us, that if Jesus Christ actually got out of the grave, then we are dealing with God himself. And if we're dealing with God himself, then he gets to be in charge. And everything else we believe about Jesus flows from that reality. And the same thing goes for the author of Ecclesiastes. He's still asking the same question. Who do we think we are dealing with when we come to God, and who is really in charge? And how we answer that question will have significant implications on the rest of what he's going to teach us throughout our time. And that was why I chose that point to break in our text of Ecclesiastes. Because I wanted to pause and look again at Jesus and see that we're dealing with God. He gets to be in charge. And now we get to go back into the book of Ecclesiastes and begin to explore some of the implications of who Jesus is. So with that, we're going to look at these two verses and see what the teacher would say to us about life under the sun in verses 8 and 9 of chapter 5. If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter. For the high official is watched by a higher, and there are yet higher ones over them. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. There is a lot that's included in these two passages, in these two verses. It's interesting because even in the original language, people aren't entirely sure how to interpret them. And as we look at them this morning, I'm going to give you both a positive and a negative interpretation of these two verses, and not everyone agrees. But there's a lot of information here. The first one being that you are going to see oppression in the world, and it shouldn't surprise you when you do. Now, if you recall our time together looking at Ecclesiastes, we already know that. We've already seen that. We've already seen oppression, injustice, and unrighteousness, and the author points us to them and goes, wouldn't you agree, as you observed life under the sun, that you see oppression? But then he talks about this authority. He talks about government. He talks about leaders, and he somehow connects these two things. So in a way, it shouldn't surprise us that there's a positive and negative interpretation of these verses. The truth is, probably any given day, if you think about government, you either have a positive reaction or a negative reaction to government. Any given day, we could be different. But I'm going to give you both of the interpretations, and you can decide for yourself, because there's a positive interpretation of verse 8 and a negative one, and a positive and negative interpretation of verse 9. So let's start with verse 8. If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter. For the high official is watched by a higher, and there are higher ones over them. So here's what we know. Here's what we can agree on. Here's what the text is clear about. There will be oppression. Justice and righteousness will be violated, and we should not be surprised by it. That's what we know. Don't be surprised that there's oppression of the poor and that justice and righteousness are violated, because that's exactly what you should expect to find if you look only at life under the sun. Is there any place, as you look around, anywhere that you can look, that doesn't contain within it some form of oppression or injustice or unrighteousness? And again, he's not asking you to like it. Because our immediate response is to say, no, that not in my community. Well, dig deeper. Dig deeper. Ask the question. Is there any place you can look at if all you have is life under the sun where you don't find some form of oppression or injustice or unrighteousness? And the problem is there any government that has ever perfectly fulfilled the biblical mandate to support justice and righteousness? And that is the biblical mandate. That the biblical mandate on the authority, the God-ordained assignments for earthly governments, is to ensure that justice is protected and carried out, and that the people's ability for righteous behavior is protected. The government doesn't need to condone, necessarily, righteous behavior, but it needs to protect for it to occur. The problem is that life under the sun very rarely looks the way that God intended it to look. And so, look around. Is there anywhere where you don't find oppression, injustice, or unrighteousness? And is there any government who has ever perfectly carried out their mandate? And so the next line could be positive or it could be negative. I'll give you the negative interpretation first. Here's what he says. The high official is watched by a higher, and there are higher ones over them. Now, we take for granted that our English translation is given to us in a certain way, but it's trying to interpret very difficult language in the original text. And so if you look at those texts, and even if you look at the Latin or the Greek version of this, which were the earliest interpretations, there's challenge in the interpretation. So what we know is there's going to be oppression. Now here's what he says, but the high official is watched by a higher, and there are higher ones over them. So the negative interpretation is basically this, that there is no authority that is not as corrupt as the one below them. So that corruption goes all the way to the top. The highest authority exploits the guy beneath him, and then that guy exploits the guy beneath him, and everyone goes and exploits the one beneath them until you come to who? The poor. The people at the bottom of the totem pole who have no one left to exploit. That they are the ones who lose. They are left powerless. And so we might say it this way in the old familiar phrase, all power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now that's a pretty negative viewpoint, but isn't it sometimes true? This week, as I was studying and preparing for this, I went down a research rabbit trail and started reading about the infamous car accident at Chappaquiddick. It's coming out. It's the subject of a movie that either came out or is coming out in 2018. And I started looking at the details and reading about it. Most of you will recall, if you don't know, that the incident involved Senator Ted Kennedy, and he drove his car off a bridge at Chappaquiddick in Massachusetts, which resulted in the death of the female passenger, Mary Jo Kopechne. Now, as I was reading that, it struck me that nobody really knows what happened. And if you look into the research, you find out that the reason that nobody really knows what happened is that immediately, the next day, first of all, no one was called to the scene, but the next day, after people started realizing what happens, regardless of whether or not Senator Kennedy was guilty or innocent, or whether he intended it to happen, or whatever else actually happened, the political spin machine ramped up and it went into overdrive, convoluting facts, covering up details, releasing false information to muddy the waters so much that no one would really ever know what happened. Regardless of what you think about it, the truth is that it's an example of how one guy does something wrong and the next guy protects him and the next guy above him protects him and the next guy and the next guy, so that we never actually know what happened. And then this morning, I open up my news on my phone and you find out that there's another chemical attack in Syria. And but you read the details and you go, well, no one really knows who does it. We think we know. We think, well, it was probably the Syrian government. But you know why it's going to be hard to peg it in the Syrian government? Because whoever committed it, there's someone above him who's just as corrupt, who's protecting it. It goes up and up and up, and you find out that maybe it ends somewhere in Russia. Or the other possibility is that, well, maybe it was the rebels, and they just did it, sort of like a Hunger Games scenario, where they committed an atrocity against their own people to blame it on the Syrians so that there's an international response. And you go, well, what really happened? Well, we don't know. You know why? Because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and it goes up the line, and this is maybe the interpretation of this verse. That why does oppression happen? Well, you look at your local magistrate, but there's somebody above him that's just as corrupt as him, and on up the ladder. Saying this is why you shouldn't be surprised when you discover that there's oppression. Of course, there's also a positive interpretation of this. It's not all doom and gloom. The positive interpretation of that verse is that while we still shouldn't be surprised that there is oppression and there are violators of justice and righteousness, that the increasing levels of authority are actually there to give us hope. So that even though we might find that something happens on the lower level, we can trust that the lower authority reports to someone higher, and they report to someone higher, and on it goes. And in fact, this is the way that the justice system in the United States is set up, so that if we feel like we didn't receive justice in a lower court, we can make an appeal to a higher court. And on it goes up to the highest authority. It doesn't change the fact that there's still oppression. We shouldn't be surprised when we see it, but at least there's some semblance of hope in the increasing levels of authority. Of course, it's not really working, because he says there's still oppression, but at least there's some semblance of hope. That's the positive interpretation. Then we go on to verse 9. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. Now, once again, the English leads us to a certain conclusion, but it's actually translating some very difficult text. And there's a positive way of looking at it and a negative. Here's the negative way. The negative interpretation flows from the idea that all of the authorities are in on the cronyism, and they're all just there to get theirs. And so since they're all looking out for one another, perpetuating the corruption all the way up, best case scenario for all of them, for everyone in the land, is if you have a king committed to profiting off of the land. If the king is there and he profits off the land, then all of the authorities underneath him are also going to profit off the land, because the cronyism goes all the way to the top and all the way to the bottom. Well, maybe we don't want to think about that negative interpretation, but you'd have to admit, as we consider even our own government sometimes, right, that it certainly happens, that there's lobbying groups that lobby people on both sides of the aisle. Many major corporations give money to senators and representatives in order that they'll vote one way or the other, and most corporations and lobby groups give money to people on both sides of the aisle, just in case. And you go, well, in a way, there's this profiting off of the people that goes all the way up, and who's left out? The poor, the oppressed, the people who have no power. Well, that's a pretty bleak view, but maybe it's not entirely inaccurate. But the positive interpretation on this, in this case, isn't all that great. It's just better than the alternative. The teacher's view of authority and the fact that oppression is commonplace and we shouldn't be surprised is still in view. There's still oppression. But he says, this is the reason for the but this is profit for the land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. It's still better for everyone to have a king that's committed to order than not have any king at all. To say it another way, tyranny is still better than anarchy. Well, that's not a very great view, but at least it's one way to look at it. Having a government, even if there's flaws in the system, is better than not having one. And so we have to admit that in our own context. It's easy for us, especially nowadays, when all of the information we want is at our fingertips, to get really frustrated with the governmental systems. But better to have a government than to not have one at all. And so even despite its flaws, we should admit that having a government that's mostly organized and has attempted to put safeguards in place against corruption, even though corruption might still exist, is better than not having a government at all. Now here's the thing. Whether you examine these texts and take a more positive view or you take a more negative view, the truth is that either way, it's still pretty bleak. Either way, as you examine life under the sun, while there might be some comfort for those who are oppressed, some slight hope that things will get better, the teacher is upfront about the fact that they probably won't. That oppression still exists. And it's going to exist, and you shouldn't be amazed by it. That's hardly something you say if you think that things are going to get better anytime soon. That's why we have to go back to the question that we were reminded of as we began. Who do we think we're dealing with? And who is really in charge? You see, the teacher wants you to take a look at life under the sun. He wants you to look around. He wants you to make an observation, and he's asking you honestly, will you come to any other conclusion, that if all you have is your circumstances, if all you have is your government, if all you have is the leaders and the authorities around you, would you come to any other conclusion than that oppression will always exist, that there is no hope, and that the system is broken? He wants you to think about it. That's why he says, don't be surprised that there is oppression when all you have is the system under the sun to solve your problem. He's just asking you to consider whether it's true. He's not asking you to like it. But we aren't without hope. You see, that's why if we ended there, you'd leave and you'd go, well, then what's the point? And he goes, yeah, exactly. What would be the point? But you aren't without hope. Because at the end of the day, there is a higher authority. There is something in us that knows there must be more than oppression, that there must be actual justice, that righteousness is a thing that can be attained. And the teacher says, exactly. That's why I want you to look around and see, can you find it under the sun? If the answer is no, then you must need to look somewhere else to discover it. You know it's there. You know oppression is wrong. You know injustice is wrong. You know that unrighteousness is wrong. But if you want to know why, you have to look higher than what you see under the sun. You have to see God. That's why I had planned to come back into Ecclesiastes immediately after Easter, starting here in particular. Because the death and resurrection are the pinnacle of the biblical story, and it actually provides us with real hope to some of the issues that are raised. That the death and resurrection of Jesus provide us with hope that oppression can be overcome, that justice can be had, that righteousness can become evident in this world. All of these are dealt with in the death and resurrection of Jesus, and we're going to see it from two perspectives. First, from a top-down perspective, and then from a bottom-up perspective. But let's consider the top-down. Do you remember last week we look at the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and Matthew ties it into the Great Commission. Everything from Matthew ends with this pinnacle moment in Galilee where Jesus, we see his death, his condemnation, his death. He dies on the cross. He's buried in the tomb. Easter Sunday, he raises up, and Matthew's continually pointing towards Galilee. And he says the whole point of this is coming up. I'm going to summarize it for you. As soon as we get to Galilee, finally we get to Galilee, and Jesus stands up. And the pinnacle statement that Matthew records is that Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That this is what happens at the resurrection. All authority has been given to me. And so when he's with Pilate, they have this big discussion about authority because we talked about how Pilate is the governor of the area around Jerusalem, and the high priest and the chief priest, they bring Jesus to him because they know Pilate's the only one who is able to condemn Jesus to death. Pilate's the only one who has the quote-unquote authority to do it. But he also has the authority to release Jesus. Life under the sun. He does. If all you had is life under the sun, then there's no one higher than Pilate who can condemn Jesus to death or who can release Jesus. And so he looks at Jesus. He goes, what's your problem? Don't you understand that I have the authority under the sun? And Jesus is like, you would have no authority at all if it wasn't given to you from above. Because authority doesn't stop under the sun. Authority actually goes up. And so Jesus, after he's resurrected, when he delivers the Great Commission, he says, the opening line, most important thing he says, all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. That is the motivating factor, the catalyst for everything else that happens in the church. That from there on out, the people in the church are not intimidated or afraid of what the authorities under the sun would do to them. Because they were well aware that they served an authority in the king that was higher than anything they would find under the sun. That they could actually live and move forward understanding that there was an authority that was given to Jesus that led toward instruction in the church, how we're to handle authority when we have it. That we see it in the way that the church unfolds and the teaching that's given to them. And so it allows us to have a more positive view of what the teacher of Ecclesiastes tells us. Because when we look at the authority, we can keep going up the ladder until it ends with Jesus. That there's no authority that anybody has that ultimately doesn't stop there. And so it gives us hope that even though the local magistrate might be oppressive, there will come a day when justice and righteousness are served. We can have hope. But this is really important. Even though we know that Jesus is the authority at the top, that's not where the change begins. It doesn't start top down. Jesus doesn't get rid of the Caesar and put in his own guy. He doesn't fire Pilate and put in somebody. He doesn't start with the government system and start overthrowing government leaders and putting in his own people. The change actually begins from the bottom up. It begins because we know who's at the top, but the change begins from the bottom and moves its way up. To say it the way that we read it in Ecclesiastes, our new king is dedicated to cultivated fields. But the cultivated fields of Jesus are the transformed community of the church. That's the way that order is going to be restored. And so order is restored through transformed communities from the bottom up. So if you look at the evidence in the book of Acts for what happened in the church, why did the world change? Why did the world change so that tens and hundreds and thousands of years later, the mark of Christianity was so powerful that it had changed the way institutions operated? Why? Because it started from the ground up. Because what we see in the book of Acts is that it was a community of people who began to live so radically different from the world that it didn't really matter that the government was still oppressive, because in the little community of people that God had brought together, oppression no longer exists. That it didn't matter that there was still injustice in the world, because the people in that little new transformed community decided, well, injustice won't exist here. That it didn't matter that there was unrighteousness in the world, because unrighteousness wouldn't exist here. And so both in the example and the teaching that Paul and Peter and the other apostles give the early church is all about, here's what your community will look like now that you serve a higher authority. That you can actually live in a way that you serve a different king. So male and female relationships are transformed. That Paul talks about how we're to treat one another and how we were to treat one another in relationship. That we don't oppress one another. We don't treat one another as purely sexual beings. We don't abuse one another. We don't use our positions of power to make others serve us. He talks about how our parenting relationships are transformed. Like, your role as a parent isn't just to make sure your kid doesn't die by the time they're 18. Your role is actually to raise up new believers in Christ who will carry out this kingdom mandate and live that way. So people see that developing within the church and in the community. That master and servant or employer-employee relationships are being transformed. So that you couldn't see your employee anymore as somebody who was only there to serve your interests. But actually you were to see your employee as somebody who God had given you authority, God in His authority gives you authority to serve, to make your employee's life better. And in so doing, that person will do his job more and better. That we serve one another, that relationships are transformed, how we view one another is transformed, not from the top down, but from the bottom up, because we know the person at the top. Now, out of that transformed community come leaders. And out of that transformed community come people who begin to take positions of power. And if God is calling you into leadership or into an authoritative role, you should take that role. Because we need leaders at all government levels. We need leaders in business. We need leaders in institutions. We need leaders in our organizations who understand that Jesus is at the top, but have their feet, this is so important, have their feet, you as a leader, have your feet firmly rooted in a transformed community. That you don't separate yourself from that community, but you remain in that community so that as you take leadership and authority, you are not only governed by the authority who's on top of you, but you are regulated by the people around you who stand in equal footing with you. That those two things are important. That transformation, we know the one at the top, but transformation comes from the bottom and goes up. And so some of us are called into politics. Others are called into leadership in local organizations, local businesses. Others are going to be community leaders. But every single one of us is called to the transformation that Christ is doing within our local community so that it's not going to happen out there. It's not going to happen on Facebook. It's not going to happen on social media. It's not going to happen on the internet. We can't change, you can't change anything that happens outside of this community, but in this community. Like, don't be surprised when you see oppression. Don't be surprised when you see injustice. Don't be surprised when you see unrighteousness. But when people see us, we go, but oppression won't happen here. Injustice won't happen here. Unrighteousness won't happen here. because we respond to a higher authority. We have a higher king, and he has transformed this circle of people, this community of people, so that here we love one another, so that here we are equals, so that here we do not oppress or we do not respond with injustice or unrighteousness, so that here people begin to see what the kingdom of God is really like. See, that's what the teacher is getting at. If all you have is life under the sun, you don't have a mechanism for figuring out how to deal with oppression. The very system that's supposed to stop injustice in the system, the rulers who are supposed to stop injustice, are most often the very ones who perpetrate and perpetuate that injustice. But there is a new system and a new authority, and that new authority is Jesus, and that new system is the church. That's why change happens, and that's why we can have hope. Let's pray. Father, may we be people of change. May we see that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to your Son, so that we, Lord, no longer are depressed or upset or intimidated by the government powers that are around us, the systems that are in place that perpetrate and perpetuate the oppression that we should not be amazed by that it happens, but rather, Lord, should we be people who say, but it will not happen here. Father, be with us. May we be agents of change whose feet are firmly rooted in community of believers along with us, who serve a higher authority and seek to change the world. Be with us, Lord, in your name.